All right. Good evening and welcome. We are thrilled to have you all here, and we're thrilled to have Carl with us for this evening. I'm Pastor Kay. I'm the pastor here at this church, and this is just a fellowship time, an informal time, and a chance for us to expand our knowledge about a variety of different things. And we're really excited to have Carl with us this evening. Before I introduce him, though, I would be remiss if I didn't give a further invitation, and that is when Carl is finished, please come downstairs. We have two ways to get down. You can go this way or you can go out this way and down. This is the shorter. There are pastries and coffee, and I am told you're all, we are all, Bob tells me, to eat at least 3 or 4. We sent Bob and he was hungry. So please, we invite you down to join us for fellowship time after we're finished. And it is my pleasure to be able to introduce to you Dr. Carlton Young, who has his bachelor's degree in economics from Westminster College and in history from Point Park University, and he has a master's degree in economics from Westminster, in English from Point Park, and then in history from Ohio University. He has an MA, so he's got a varied background. He's got his PhD in history of education from the University of Pittsburgh, and he spent 37 years at teaching AP American history at Thomas Jefferson High School. He's also taught classes as an adjunct professor at the Community College of Allegheny County, the University of Pittsburgh, Eastern Gateway Community College, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Center of Carnegie Mellon University. So he is well-versed in a number of different things, but the thing that he's going to talk to us about now, I think, is beyond just the academics. This is from the heart, as he talks about letters from the attic. And these are letters that are from his family. And he and a team of folks, and part of the team is here tonight, and we're grateful for that. But he's going to share more about that. So, Carl, we are thrilled to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for coming out on this Veterans Day to hear a story about a couple of veterans from long ago. And I guess I should mention also the reason for this chair is I've developed a little bit of a balance problem, and so I'll probably be standing some and sitting some. This whole getting older thing just wasn't exactly what I expected. But at any rate, the story that I'm going to be telling you today, it's a story that starts with something which probably many of you have had to experience at some point in your life, which is about 12 or 13 years ago, we had to empty out my parents' house. They had passed away, and if you've ever had to empty out someone else's house, you know there's a lot involved in that. It's not just furniture and appliances, but there's all that stuff to deal with, all the things in closets and drawers and storage areas, and trying to decide real fast what you're going to do with it all. Now, this is the house I'd grown up in, over in Churchill, over in the eastern side of town. I wasn't expecting to find much of anything I wasn't familiar with, but up in the attic, we found this very old wooden box that I'd never seen before. Once we opened it up, we found it was just jammed full of very old letters, which turned out to be letters written by 2 brothers in the Civil War. Their last name was Martin, Henry and Francis Martin. They were from a little town called Williamstown in Vermont. And it also turned out they were members of what was called the Vermont Brigade, which was a Union brigade which was renowned for their heroism and fighting ability. So just the fact they were from the Vermont Brigade made these letters important. And there were a lot of them. And when I say we had a lot of letters, I've seen entire books based on someone having like 20 letters of a Civil War soldier, or 40 letters, or 60 letters, whatever. Well, we had about 250. So it was an enormous collection. This is the box. The letters, they said, were just jammed in there, most of them in their original envelopes, stamped and addressed to their parents up there in Vermont. So the next step for me, as you heard, I had a bit of a background in history, but had never had any special interest in the Civil War. So fortunately, there were a couple of local friends who were much more Civil War buffs than I'd ever been. And they're actually both here tonight, Ed Hill and Bill Lutz. And they started looking at a few of the letters and said, yeah, these are really good letters. We definitely are going to have to do something with this. So next step was to call in our wives. My wife, Carol, Ed's wife, Nancy. The five of us began to have weekly meetings to go through these letters together. First thing we did was get them into acid-free folders to protect them, then get them organized in terms of like who wrote each one, to whom, from where, get them chronological, get them all set up. Then the next step was to actually start to read them. And that proved to be a kind of a difficult process sometimes. This is an example of one of the letters. So if you think of a piece of paper folded in half, page 1 over on this side, 4 over here. In this case, it's Henry writing to his brother who hadn't entered the service yet from June of 1862 from camp in front of Richmond, Virginia. So this is very early in the war when the Union Army almost got into Virginia, or almost got into Richmond. He gets to the bottom, signs his name right there. But then he thinks of something else he wants to say. Well, they had shortages of paper. He does not want to waste another sheet. So he turns the letter sideways and writes directly across what he's already written and signs his name a second time right there. This was known as cross-writing, and soldiers did this sometimes, and unfortunately our soldiers did this a lot. And so, for example, we have, this is a month later. Now it's July of 1862. They've been pushed down to Harrison's Landing. Once again, Henry writing to his brother, gets to the 4th page, and writes all the way across what he's already written. Another thing we found sometimes, like in this next letter, is that very often he started writing real small when you get towards the end, trying to fit it all in, but still didn't fit, so he goes back to page 1 and does cross-writing right there. Or another thing we found was that sometimes, like this next letter, he'd be starting off writing kind of slowly and carefully, it'd be relatively easy to read, but then it would become increasingly sloppy as the letter would go on and then throwing the things down here. And just one more example, because this one has a little bit of everything. Not only does it become sloppy and small, but then it goes back to page 1 and writes directly across that. So at our weekly meetings, the 5 of us would have copies of the letters, and we'd be turning it this way and that way and trying to figure out, we get stuck on a word. Sometimes we'd sit there for 2 or 3 minutes in silence, or mumbling to ourselves what that word could be. And then usually somebody would get it. They'd shout out the word. We'd all say, yeah, that's it. And then we'd go to the next word, and on it would go. So it took us a long time. It took us several years to get through these letters once. And then we went back and started over again because we'd skipped a lot of words and passages. Now we knew the handwriting better. We knew their story. We were able to fill in the gaps and get these letters completely transcribed. So that was one thing we were doing. Another thing we were doing was traveling. We would travel down to the battlefields, talk to sometimes park rangers and park historians, and show them copies of the relevant letters. And they were always real impressed with how in-depth these letters were. But the other thing we did was to travel to the boys' hometown up in Vermont. So Williamstown, Vermont is in central Vermont. It's about 6 miles south of Barre, Vermont, which in turn is about 6 miles south of the state capital of Montpelier, right in the center of the state. Now, my father had grown up in Barre, Vermont, so we always knew these letters had to be connected in some way to my father's side of the family. But anyway, this congregational church there in the center of town was built in the early 1820s, and it is the church that our soldiers grew up in. They, first time we went up there, we parked right by this church, and it's kind of interesting. We've just to jump ahead of the story a little bit, one of the things that really surprised us in the letters was how good the mail service was during the Civil War. That these boys would be getting letters down in their camp in Virginia, sometimes they'd been only written 2 or 3 days earlier from up in Vermont. And since the mail service was that good, people would send care packages, perishable goods, the food items the boys could eat. And one of the things that their church sent on several occasions was chicken pies. These big chicken pot pies the boys would get in the camp and eat. And they'd be writing home thanking the church members for that. So a few years ago, my wife and I were up in Vermont. We were driving through Williamstown, and in front of their church was a big banner that said, "Chicken pie dinner tonight." It turns out that whereas churches around here oftentimes have fish fries, up in Vermont, churches have chicken pie dinners as fundraisers. And so we were able to go into the boys' church and eat that recipe for chicken pie. Sadly, a couple months ago, a fire swept through the church, completely destroyed it, except for the only thing they were able to salvage was the Paul Revere Company bell and the bell tower of the church. But at any rate, next to the church is a Civil War monument. So the first time we went up there, we parked by the church. We walked over to this monument, and we're walking along. Names were all around it. We were reading the names of the boys from the town, and our 2 brothers are not listed. We thought, this is crazy. We drove all the way to Vermont, but we know they're here. The letters are addressed here, and we have their military records. So this was one of many mysteries that made this so interesting for us, because there was, well, for me, the mystery of, I knew my family history a bit. I'd never heard of anyone with the last name of Martin in my family. Had no ideas if there was a family connection, why these letters had ended up here in Pittsburgh in my parents' attic, why my father never said to me, "Oh, by the way, you like history. You should see what I have. I have all these Civil War letters." And none of this made a whole lot of sense. This one we did get pretty well figured out, I think, though. By going through old town records, we found that when they built this monument in 1869, they decided to only put on the names of the boys who were drafted to fill the town quota. Our 2 brothers enlisted, so they were not eligible. Now, why they did that we haven't quite figured out. We're thinking there might have been some kind of local political dispute or something going on that they would limit the names in that way, but that's what they chose to do. Anyway, next to the monument, next building down there is the local historical society. So the first time we went up there, we went over to the historical society, decided to tell the person inside a little bit about our letters, how they're addressed to the boy's father. His name was Chester Martin. So we asked the person, we said, we know it's been a century and a half, but have you ever heard of somebody named Chester Martin living somewhere around town here, a local farmer? And the person in the historical society said, well, sure, Chester Martin's house, it's right down the road, I'll give you directions. So down we went and we found the house. So this is the house that our 2 soldiers grew up in, still there today. Now it is the front of a assisted living home. And so they've taken out the back wall and built the assisted living complex to the back and to the side. We had no idea we were going to find this. We find the house, we walk inside, and turns out that the original house is now like the lobby and office area. We walk inside, it's all decorated 19th century. So we didn't even know we were going to find our boy's house. We find it, we walk inside, and it's like it was at the time of the Civil War. Then we went up to the cemetery. We were walking along. We know the names on markers, trying to find the burial sites. We saw this kind of railed-in section towards the back and thought, could that be? And went back, and sure enough, that was our Martin family, Chester Martin, his wife, and all of his children buried there in this family plot. So it's just been one interesting find after another for us. As far as the soldiers, the first one I want to look at is Henry. His full name was William Henry Martin. He went by Henry. Now, Henry, as far as we can tell, must have been a relatively friendly, well-liked person, because when his regiment was formed, as I said, he was in the Vermont Brigade, which was the 2nd through the 6th Infantry Regiments from Vermont. He was in the 4th Vermont. And when that regiment was formed, it's a lot of young guys from the same county. Many of them have been in school together. They know each other. And they were allowed to select some of their own officers. And they did choose Henry, initially as a sergeant and eventually as a second lieutenant. We also know about Henry that he's got a pretty good education for that time period. That at the point in time of the Civil War, there were not yet any public high schools. For children who were going to school, their education usually ended at about the 8th grade level. But for families that had a bit more money, and you saw from the house, this family's fairly well off, those families would often send their children to private academies, secondary schools. And Henry had attended Barry Academy, nearby Barry, Vermont. His brother, Francis, who we'll be looking at, attended Kimball Union Academy, which is a private residential school in New Hampshire, which is still in operation today. And even their sister, and this was especially a little unusual for that time period, their sister Caroline, for a young girl from a rural farming area to go to a private residential school was not typical. But Caroline had attended Mrs. Peabody's Select Family School for Young Women, which was located on the campus of Dartmouth College, there at the Webster Hall. And so this is a family that very clearly values education. And I think that's one of the reasons their letters are so good compared to a lot of other ones, that these guys, they knew how to write and they really told their story as they went through the whole Civil War. We also had in with the letters lots of other things. There were lots of handwritten orders from different officers who got mixed in with the letters. There was officer commission papers like these for Henry. And by eventually putting together my family tree to connect to them, I found a cousin who I didn't even know I had, but contacted her, and she ended up having Henry's sword. And so we went to visit, and there it is, William Henry Martin, Company A, 4th Vermont Infantry. So as I said, it's been just one interesting find after another as we've gone through this. Okay, as for their story then, for Henry, he'll be, as I said, entering the war in the 4th Vermont. He enlists just after the first battle of Bull Run. He'll be heading down to Washington, D.C. for training, traveling by combination of steamboat and railroad car. Now they have to go through Maryland, and Maryland, of course, is a little different kind of case because Maryland was a slave state, but it was staying in the Union for the Civil War. But that meant there was a lot of mixed opinion, people who were pro and anti-Confederate. And so in one of his first letters, is going through Maryland, Henry said, and there had been problems, there had been cases of recruits being attacked by pro-Confederate mobs. So Henry says, "We passed through the streets where the Massachusetts men had been mobbed, but we did not have any trouble. Some people would wish us to bring back Jefferson Davis's scalp. Others would cry out, hooray for Davis. After dinner, we took the cars for Washington. We left the cars and marched to a place called the Soldiers' Rest. There we stacked arms, ate supper, spread our blankets, and slept the rest of the night. In the morning, we received orders to march to our encampment about 3/4 of a mile from the city of Washington. There we joined a large army of 40,000 men. I never saw such a sight before. There were thousands of cavalry, flying artillery, and infantry on drill when we arrived. The cavalry charging at full speed, accompanied with flying artillery, was a grand sight." So this is all very exciting for Henry at first. Now the camp where he's talking about there, I did find a photograph. This is Vermont Brigade Camp outside of Washington, D.C. Where it was located actually is what is today the grounds of the CIA headquarters. So I have thought it might be fun to show up at the CIA someday and tell them about my letters and say, it's okay if I just walk around and check things out here and see what they have to say. But at any rate, Henry will be there for a long time, for many months of training. And while he's there, one of the things he's going to be doing, which would not have occurred to me, but he does get to do a good bit of sightseeing. You know, coming from a small town up in central Vermont, this is real exciting for him. And he'll talk in his letters about crossing the Chain Bridge. I found this photo, Chain Bridge during the Civil War time. And then working his way into the city. And he talks about walking past the White House and getting to a tour through the Capitol building and going to the Smithsonian Museum. So he's having a kind of exciting time of it. Things are going pretty well for a while. But then there starts to be a big problem. And the problem is going to be disease. you've got this situation, all these young guys, many have never traveled far from home before. Now they're all mixed together in these camps. So you've got problems with immunities to disease. You've got the fact they just don't know a lot about good healthcare and hygiene, and people start to get sick. Henry will write home after he's been there for a couple of months. There's a great amount of sickness in the regiment. Charles Lynn's very bad, John Green's unwell, Fay's on the sick list, also Deck Jones, Cosgrove, Frank Flint. And of course, his parents know all these people because they're all in the same area where they were recruited. Measles and mumps prevail extensively. Newell Carleton is quite sick with typhoid fever, but we hope he will soon be better. His friend Newell does not improve. In a later letter, Henry writes, "As soon as he was confined to his bunk, I had him moved to my tent where it was more still and more spare room. He remained there about 2 weeks, received as good a care and attention as could be given to the circumstances. He was not in his right mind at nights, constantly spoke of his father, and was finally removed to the hospital, where he received pretty good care, but he grew worse every time his fever changed, and last Saturday night, about 8 p.m., he died." So that became the first of many friends and relatives of Henry who will die in this war. And as time goes on, things just kept getting worse and worse in the camp. In a later letter, he says, "When we left Vermont, my regiment numbered 1,100 strong, able-bodied men. Over 60 have now died of disease, and a great number are sick. My company numbered 101. Today, only 36 privates are available for duty." So they are having a terrible time with the health issues. In a later letter, he writes to his parents. He says, "I see sights that would make any one of you at home shudder. Almost every morning, we see outside the hospital a corpse of one of our fellow soldiers, there to remain until the next day. Finally, the corpse is dressed, placed in a pine coffin, and ready for burial." And I found this photograph, which is Vermont soldiers at the camp burying some of their dead. Henry, in his letter, goes through the whole procedure, what they do at these burial ceremonies, but kind of interesting the way he closed the letter. He says, "All of these scenes we become familiar with and think but little of." So it's just like an everyday thing. They stop their training, go out to bury some of their fellow soldiers, come back, continue the training, on it goes day after day and month after month in this camp. Now, before Henry actually goes into combat, just a couple of things I wanted to take a look at, in particular, some of the other people in the letters, because it amazes as we go off on these tangents. Henry would talk about people there in camp or people back home, and we'd research them and find out all these interesting stories. So one in particular is Uncle Isaac. So this is Henry's uncle, Isaac Lind, who very early in the war was given the command out west, way out west, all the way out in New Mexico. And in a very early phase of the war, a group of Texans, Confederates, came across the border. Isaac Lind took his men out to face them. Now, unless you are a true Civil War buff, you probably never heard of the Battle of Mesilla. It's not one of your big Civil War battles. Only a few hundred people on both sides, so very small in terms of the scope of the Civil War, light casualties. But Isaac Lind felt it was not going well, pulled his men back into his fort. But he also realized the fort was not really defensible because he knew the Texans had artillery with them. So the next day, he decided on a fast march to another fort. Unfortunately, some of his men just could not bear the thought of leaving behind their stores of whiskey. Many of them filled their canteens with whiskey instead of water. Next day, they're out in the hot desert sun. People are getting sick, dehydrated. The Texans catch up with them and surround them. Isaac Lind has to surrender his entire force. Now, like I said, in terms of numbers, this really is not significant for the whole scope of the Civil War. But for Isaac Lind, he had the misfortune of this happening just 3 days after the First Battle of Bull Run. The First Battle of Bull Run being this surprising first defeat in the war for the Union side. And now comes word they've just lost another battle out west. So it doesn't go over real well. Isaac Lind relieved of his command. So he comes back to Washington, D.C. He wants to get a private meeting with Abraham Lincoln, to give his side of the story about what happened out west. And he'll be staying in the Vermont Brigade camp because he knows a lot of people there, including his son, that'd be Henry's cousin, who's in the same regiment as Henry. But Isaac Lind also has a daughter. His daughter, Louise, was married to Brigadier General Frederick Dent. Now, Frederick Dent, back in his school days at West Point, had been roommates and very close friends with Ulysses S. Grant. And in fact, he introduced Grant to his sister, Julia, who Grant then married. So Henry's cousin from this little town that he's grown up with is not only married to a brigadier general, but she's sister-in-law to Ulysses S. Grant. And Isaac Lind has another daughter. His other daughter, Mary, is married to Major Norman Fitzhugh, who is Assistant Adjutant General for General Jeb Stuart, who, if you're familiar with the Civil War, you know he's on the other side. He's the Confederate cavalry leader. And so it just amazes, this town is so small, but the number of people we found that impacted not just the Civil War, but the years that followed, it's just way out of proportion to the number of people in this town. But anyway, back to Henry and the war. So during all these months of training, he is under the command of General McClellan. This is the Army of the Potomac, which is the large army in the north, large army in the east. Its job being to protect Washington, D.C., and also to try to capture Richmond. And so with all those months of training, a lot of people were feeling, and McClellan still has a reputation today, seeming to be overly cautious and slow-moving. And that kind of attitude is shown in Henry's letters too. In one letter he says, "We still remain in camp. You can see how many expectations we have and how few are realized. Soldiers remark quite often, they'll never have a chance of seeing a rebel if they stay in this army." So that was the feeling, like, enough training, let's get into this. And even though it seemed like McClellan's just kind of sitting around not doing anything, he actually is coming up with a plan. So the plan that he eventually is going to be unleashing is what's called the Peninsula Campaign, that will involve leaving from Washington, D.C., traveling by sea down to Fort Monroe, and then moving towards Richmond along this peninsula, attacking from the east and trying to avoid a lot of the Confederate defenses north of Richmond. So Henry is part of this massive force of 100,000 men traveling by sea to Fort Monroe. From there, then, they will, here's Fort Monroe, they'll start moving out the peninsula, facing scattered resistance, pushing the Confederates back. There'll be a lot of small battles. One of those small battles is fought right here along the Warwick River. And once again, unless you are a real Civil War buff, you probably never heard of the Battle of Dam Number 1. But for Henry, Dam Number 1 is a real significant event, because this is the first time he's ever actually gone into combat. He writes home, "This was a memorable day in my experience, the first time I ever faced cold lead from an enemy's guns." And he describes in his letter how they got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, had breakfast, got words of encouragement from their officers, and then went off into their charge. And when we visited Dam Number 1, I took this photo, which shows Confederate earthworks that are still there, these defensive positions where Henry and the fellow Vermont soldiers are going to be charging towards these defensive positions. And so he writes, "Our colonel led the charge, flourishing his sword, encouraging his men on. Not a man flinched from his duty. It was a desperate charge, I'll assure you, in the face of thousands of rebels. My regiment lost only 10 killed. Other regiments suffered fearfully, and the enemy must have lost hundreds as our shot and shells kept bursting over their rifle pits." So Henry goes through the whole battle, but kind of interesting the way he concludes it. He says, "I never expected to feel as I did on the occasion. After the first few shots, I felt perfectly self-possessed, ready to go anywhere we're ordered. This is a hasty outline of what occurred, but I must close, and if spared to survive another battle, I shall write as soon as possible." I can't help but imagine his mother's reaction to that closing. If I'm not killed in the next battle, I'll write home as soon as it's over. We'll just see how it goes. And off he goes on this campaign. And so they're going to be moving from Dam Number 1 up the peninsula. When my wife and I started at Fort Monroe, we drove up and down the peninsula, going to all the places Henry mentions in his letters. And so I posted a picture on Facebook and said, dragging my wife to another damn Civil War site, dam number one. But at any rate, from dam number one, they will be pushing their way all the way up, fighting battles. They fight a major battle there at Williamsburg, and will continue all the way up. Now, Henry's under General Franklin, the 6th Corps. They will make it all the way within 12 miles of Richmond. And at that point, General McClellan calls the whole attack to a halt. McClellan felt these defenses ahead were too strong. There are some historians that think that with the numerical advantage the North had, they might have been able this early in the war to break through into Richmond. But instead, they stop. And along the way, Henry's seen some interesting things, like, for example, the famous battle between the two ironclads, the Merrimac and the Monitor taking place. Henry was able to go get a real close-up look at the Monitor after that battle. He was not very impressed, though. He didn't think it was going to amount to much. What he was much more impressed with in this campaign was the use of the balloons. These hydrogen-filled balloons where they could look down and see Confederate troop movements and see the defensive positioning. That he thought that was going to be a great innovation in this war. But at any rate, on the peninsula, things are about to change. On the Confederate side, Confederate General Joseph Johnston had been in charge. He is badly wounded, replaced by Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee is going to decide that the best way to defend Richmond is to go on the offensive, to start a campaign known as the 7 Days. 7 days of battles as the Confederates move out. They're pushing the Union forces away from Richmond. Henry will be involved in several of these battles, one being up here at Savage's Station, that after the fighting at Savage's Station, there was word another large Confederate force was approaching. The Union soldiers had to move out and leave their wounded behind. Henry was not at all happy about this, but I did find a photograph, and this is wounded soldiers at Savage's Station being left as the army pulls out. Another place he fights will be at White Oak Swamp. There, they're trying to stop Stonewall Jackson, who's coming from the Shenandoah Valley, to join up with Lee. And this is a drawing of the defenders at White Oak Swamp who are holding Jackson off, and they do slow him down enough that he's not able to get to where Lee needs him later in the 7 days. But at any rate, the Union Army will be forced all the way back here to Malvern Hill. President Lincoln is not going to be happy about this. He will reduce McClellan's authority, order McClellan to bring his army north of Richmond, join up under General Pope, and under Pope's leadership, attack Richmond from the north. So Henry is part of this massive force moving up in that direction. But General Lee figures out what's happening and moves faster. Lee gets up into that direction before much of McClellan's army can arrive. They will fight a battle on very familiar grounds. They're back at Bull Run for the second battle of Bull Run. Pope thought he had Stonewall Jackson cornered. He didn't realize Longstreet was out flanking him. And second Bull Run ends up another defeat for the Union Army. At that point, Lincoln is going to be turning back to McClellan to restore full leadership of the army. And it's right at this point in the war also that the Union side will get one of the biggest breaks in the war, that General Lee has decided to launch an invasion up through Maryland on to fight in the north. But in going through Maryland, he's divided his army up into dangerously small parts. One of Lee's commanders inadvertently left the orders behind at a campsite. Union soldiers had moved in, found these lost orders. Now they knew where Lee's men were all positioned. If McClellan moved real fast, he might have been able to wipe out each of these smaller groups. He does not move real fast. He's a little concerned because, for one thing, this new information does not fit very well the earlier military reports he'd received. And he's thinking, maybe this is a trick. Maybe Lee's trying to pull him in too fast. But he will start going that direction. And so Lee will be trying to form his army together along Antietam Creek there at Sharpsburg, getting his army pulled back into one unit. McClellan becoming that direction, he's got to go through this mountain range, which is called South Mountain. And there are gaps he will have to go through to get there. Now, Henry and the Vermont soldiers are in Franklin's 6th Corps. They're going through Crampton's Gap. And in his letters home, Henry talks about being towards the end of the front line, charging uphill at Crampton's Gap. And this map shows, indeed, the 4th Vermont is at the end of the front line. And this drawing is of the battle. So Henry is somewhere down in here, charging uphill. My wife and I have walked this hill, and I can tell you it's actually much steeper and more rugged looking than it looks like even right here. But not the kind of place you want to be in a battle, charging uphill that way. But as it turns out, because the Union forces do greatly outnumber the Confederates in this battle, Confederates will start to retreat, but they've done what they were sent there to do. They were sent there to slow down the Union advance while Lee gets his army put together again. And indeed, that's what Lee has done. But by the time this fighting's over, Henry's starting to sound like he's kind of had enough of this fighting. He writes home, he says, "How long is this incessant fighting to continue? Ever since we left Washington, the cannon's been booming. Seems like a severe fight every day. I was never before exposed to such a galling fire. Many a bullet whistled seemingly very close to my head. But I did not feel any like dodging, but felt perfectly cool and self-possessed. Still, it's a hard place to stand then. But trusting in the Lord to protect me, I go forward wherever I am ordered." So it sounds like he's at the end of his rope. He's had about enough of this, but he says he's a soldier. He'll go wherever he's ordered. And where he's about to be ordered to is Antietam, the single bloodiest day of the Civil War. And so at Antietam, it's a battle that starts very early in the morning, about 5 a.m. with fighting up around the East Woods and around the Dunker Church. The 6th Corps is going to be coming in a little bit later in the day, around 11 a.m., where a lot of the fighting's already happened. They'll be moving down towards the famous Sunken Road, Bloody Lane area, and in their advance, they will be pushing Confederates ahead of them. This marker at the battlefield shows where the Vermont Brigade made their advance, but then McClellan ordered them to fall back. McClellan's concern was, based on his intelligence reports, Lee's army should have been a lot bigger than what he saw in front of him. He thought Lee was hiding lots of soldiers back in reserve to pull out later, so McClellan decides to bring the entire 6th Corps back into reserve. And they will be sitting on a hillside watching the rest of the battle. When we visited the battlefield, our guide was able to take us to that hillside, so I was able to sit where the Vermont soldiers sat with a view they had of this horrible carnage that was taking place. At this battle, there are going to be more casualties in one day at Antietam than American casualties in all the battles of the Revolutionary War combined, plus all American casualties in the war and all of the battles of the War of 1812 combined, plus all American casualties in all battles of the Mexican War combined, all in one day at Antietam. Now later there'll even be far more at Gettysburg, but at least that was spread out over 3 days. So Henry is watching all this. When it's all done, he writes home. He says, "After the battle was the worst of sights. Every house was filled to the brim as thick as they could lie. Still there was no room. All the barns were filled the same way. Still there was no room. Hundreds had to lie out of doors. Many remained on the field 3 days. Many did not have their wounds dressed for 2 days. Their wounds in some instances became maggoty. The dead had to be piled in heaps and burned, as it was impossible to bury them all." And when I showed that letter to a park historian at Antietam, he said that they had heard stories that supposedly there were so many dead bodies to deal with that rather than bury them, in some cases, they just started to burn the bodies. He said he never before had seen a firsthand account. And now here it was in Henry's letter saying he had seen this, that that's what some of them were doing. So at any rate, Antietam is considered a Union victory because Lee was going to invade the North. Now he has to retreat south. But Lincoln is not happy. Lincoln felt that McClellan had let Lee get away. And so we're going to change in leadership. The new leader of the Army of the Potomac, General Ambrose Burnside. So with General Burnside, we get, well, for one thing, a new word in the English language for his facial hair, People start using the word sideburns because of Burnside. But we also get a new plan. The new plan being to move the Army of the Potomac quickly down towards Fredericksburg, to have pontoons brought down from Washington, D.C., build pontoon bridges, march the army across, get up on the heights above Fredericksburg, and wait for the Confederate Army. It was a plan that might have worked pretty well. Everything fell into place just right. And Burnside surprises Lee by moving the army very quickly down towards Fredericksburg. They get to the river, and the pontoons have not yet arrived. They're still up in the warehouse in Washington, D.C. And so they sit and they wait. And while they're waiting, Confederates will cross at another location. They'll put themselves up on the heights above Fredericksburg. So probably the prudent thing for Ambrose Burnside to have done would have been to say, well, it was a good plan, but we'll have to try something else. But there are political issues here. That this is the middle of December of 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect January 1st, 1863. Lincoln wants a big victory now. He does not want the Emancipation Proclamation to be coming out during what seems like a time of weakness. And so faced with that political pressure, Burnside decides to go ahead and launch the attack. It's going to be difficult even just getting the pontoons into place, facing enemy fire, getting across the river, then having to work their way, fighting building by building through the town, and then ultimately to charge up the hill towards the Confederate defenses behind the stone wall up at the top of the hill. There'll just be enormous casualties trying to do that. So the town is here, and where most of the fighting is taking place is soldiers coming through the town. But there is another part to this battle down in this section. And so what we have down there, now this is Franklin's 6th Corps. And so that's what Henry's a part of. They put in more pontoon bridges. So these are, actually Henry's part of the detail to install these pontoon bridges. And they will be trying to break through Stonewall Jackson's defenses and get up behind the stone wall from this direction. If you visit Fredericksburg, you'll probably spend most of your time up here because this is National Park. This area where Henry was right along Deep Run Creek right here. This area has become developed. In fact, where Henry was located right here, today there is a Wawa convenience store. But the creek is still over there. And so when we visited, we walked with copies of our letters, past the gas pumps in the convenience store, up alongside the creek, up to where Henry was. And so here's this is a blow up of the Deep Run Creek is right here. Henry is located right here. And this is artillery, which is back behind them. For a large part of this fighting, Henry is just kind of a observer, watching all these attempts, these blue arrows trying to break through the Confederate defenses, getting turned back. But then all of a sudden, you can see a big red arrow here coming right towards Henry. These are 2 North Carolina regiments that realize if they can come up alongside the creek, break through these Vermont soldiers, they can capture the artillery right back there behind them. So all of a sudden, Henry finds himself in the midst of this fighting. He writes home, he says, I was in command of my company, the captain being detached, so I was the only one left. Soon 2 regiments came out and charged on us, at these 2 North Carolina regiments. The shot flew like hail around us. We had to lie and take it. I did not let my men retreat until they were within about 10 rods of us. I found it useless to try to stop them any longer. Ordered the retreat, halted in the brow of the hill all the time, giving them a deadly fire. Just then I saw the 3rd regiment coming to my assistance. Well, as it turns out, while this is all taking place, Henry had a friend back in reserve who was watching. His friend took out a piece of paper and a pencil and sketched what was happening, and that sketch ended up in with our letters. So this is the sketch. So right here it says 4th Vermont. So Henry, as part of this group, has been pushed back. They had been up on the high ground. This is the North Carolina troops that have pushed them back, but they've reformed their lines. And then what I just read was he said the 3rd Vermont, right here it says 3rd Vermont, came to their assistance. And the next thing he says is, also our batteries opened. So remember this cannon right back here behind them? The cannon is opening fire over their heads into the North Carolina troops. says this staggered them. They turned and ran with us after them. We retook our old position. They lost, I should judge, 100 men. The ground was strewed with dead all the way back to their old position, after which they ceased firing. And so Vermont soldiers have done their part. They've held off in this attack. But back at the stone wall, things did not go so well. One regiment after another, Union regiments had come through the town, up the hill, and just been decimated before that stone wall defense. So when it's all over, Henry wrote home. He says, "Thus ended the fight. What we've accomplished, I do not see. I hope something. Our whole loss is reported 18,000. Sunday, there was a flag of truce, the wounded brought off. I crossed the line Sunday and saw some of their dead and wounded where our regiment fought. The rebels are very friendly when the flag of truce is up. The lines immediately join each other, and we exchange coffee for tobacco. The enemy are also very eager to have this war closed." So can you imagine, after a fight like that, they call a ceasefire. Both sides come out in the middle, shake hands, talk, trade things back and forth, and then go back to their respective sides. Henry says, "Monday we were relieved, went back to the rear. That night the whole army was ordered to cross the river and remained there ever since. I've been in battles before, but not in one equal to this last one. How I ever escaped, I do not imagine. Exposed to solid shot grape and canister and rifle balls by the volley. It seems as though I must have been shielded by some unseen power. I was the object of sharpshooters, being so I could not get much cover. I could do nothing but stand up and watch them fire at me. I had the privilege of seeing all that was going on, to see a rebel regiment advance on us, also to see a battle take place in the open field. I've seen enough, and hope never to see the like again. If I ever felt grateful, it was when darkness covered the field." And so this is a real low point for the Union Army after this bad defeat at Fredericksburg. But soon there will be new hope because there's new leadership. General Burnside will be replaced by General Joseph Hooker. And Joseph Hooker will be given the command of an enormous army. He has about 130,000 men. Lee with just about 65,000, so it's a 2-to-1 advantage. Hooker comes up with a plan. His plan is going to be to overwhelm this small army that Lee has. He will have his cavalry sweep around, cut off supply lines. He'll have part of the army attack from Fredericksburg. Hooker will lead the rest of the army at Chancellorsville. Lee will be caught between them. Hooker can then move his men all around and just move in and crush this much smaller army. So that's the plan. Once again, it sounds good, looks good on paper, but it's not going to quite work out that way. That Lee is going to defy conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom being, if you're greatly outnumbered, at least you keep your army intact. You do not divide up a small army. But Lee is going to do just that. Lee will leave part of his army here at Fredericksburg, take the rest to take on Hooker himself at Chancellorsville. Now, as for Henry is here. This is the 6th Corps, which has been left at Fredericksburg. So they are going to have to make that charge up towards the stone wall again. This is a photograph of some of the 6th Corps soldiers before that charge. Now, they don't know how heavily defended it is. This might be another suicide charge. But as it turns out, it's not as strongly defended. The stone wall does fall. Henry, in his letters, thought this was going to be a big turning point in the war. They've done it. They've taken the stone wall, but it ends up not really mattering much because of what happens over at Chancellorsville. At Chancellorsville, Lee's already divided his army once. Now he'll divide it a second time. He'll send Stonewall Jackson back behind the Union Army, attack Hooker from 2 directions. Hooker is so taken by surprise, he will fall back into this horseshoe-shaped defensive position. That enables Lee to divide his army up again, send part of his army back towards Fredericksburg. The 6th Corps, the Vermont soldiers coming that direction, they will fight a battle at Salem Church. Union forces are defeated. They're now under General Sedgwick. Sedgwick will order a retreat back across the river. When Hooker hears that Sedgwick has retreated, Hooker gives up and retreats as well. So Chancellorsville, another defeat for the Union Army. Seems like no one can get the best of Robert E. Lee. But Lee is not particularly happy with the way things are going either, because Lee realizes with the numerical advantage the North has, with the industrial might of the North, eventually Lincoln's going to find the right leader, someone who can defeat Robert E. Lee. And so Lee decides now is the time to try to end this war by invading the North. He will start moving up again through Maryland, heading up towards central Pennsylvania. The Union Army is now under new leadership with General Meade. Meade will be trailing Lee's army, and Meade's army, over 100,000 men, spread out over a long line. As it turns out, the Vermont soldiers are at the very end of the line. They are protecting the supply wagons at the end as they're moving north. And so when the battle takes place, well, first they have to get up there. And Henry writes a letter as they're moving up that direction. He says, "We are now on our way to Maryland in all possible haste. We are expecting one of the roughest campaigns we ever had." This is in summer, they're heavy uniforms, marching 20 or more miles a day. He says, "It's reported that 40 men have died on the road on account of the heat. Many are sunstruck. We never saw such hard marching before. We are covering the rear of the Potomac Army and have got the trains all safe within our lines. If this thing is properly managed, we will annihilate Lee's army. But we are dreadfully worn down. Pray for us. Thousands are to be sacrificed within the next few weeks." As it turns out, you could not be much more prophetic than that. This is written about 3 weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg. Henry says, thousands are about to be sacrificed, but this time we're going to do it. We're going to defeat Lee's army. As it turns out, then, that is just what will happen. So the Battle of Gettysburg, the first day, when the Union forces are pushed back through the town and start to set up their famous fishhook defensive position, the Vermont soldiers at the end of the line are they're still down in Maryland. They're about 35 miles away during this first day of fighting. The second day, they'll finally be coming in. So they're under General Sedgwick in the 6th Corps, but they're not going to be arriving until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So a lot of the fighting's already taken place, these famous parts of the battle in the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den and Chamberlain's Charge down the Little Round Top. They're missing all of that. But Henry does have a cousin who was there. It was kind of an interesting case. His cousin, George Smith, in the 17th U.S. Now, George Smith, we have a few of his letters, and he comes across as this much more very friendly, outgoing guy, talking about the good times they're having along the way and young girls they've met and all these things. Well, in this battle, he is going to be in a very difficult spot in what's called the wheat field. And very heavy casualties there. In the fighting in the wheat field, George Smith is hit with a bullet in the chest. Now, in the Civil War, if you were hit in the chest, your survival chances are not real good. In this particular case, the combination of distance and wind velocity and humidity and everything that's played a part causes them to be hit with enough force. He's knocked to the ground, looks down, and finds that the bullet had bounced off of his chest, but had not penetrated. And he's able to get back up and continue in the fighting. And ends up having a real interesting life after he survives this, that after the Civil War, he stayed in the Army, went out west, fought under General Sheridan in the Indian Wars. Then during the Gilded Age, he came back east to Philadelphia and went into business. And by the end of the century, he was listed in the Philadelphia Blue Book as one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia society. But at any rate, back to the war. At Gettysburg, third day. For the third day, the 6th Corps with the Vermont soldiers are placed behind the Round Tops. And if you're familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg, you know the focus of the third day is far from there and with Pickett's charge into the center of the lines. So Vermont soldiers don't really do much at Gettysburg. But because they hadn't done much, they will be sent out immediately to trail Lee's army as it's retreating south. And 10 days after Gettysburg, there's a small engagement in Funkstown, Maryland, between Vermont soldiers and some of the Lee's rear guard. Only 479 casualties at Funkstown, so it pales in comparison to the 55,000 plus at Gettysburg. But Henry is one of those casualties. Henry hit with shell fragments in the shoulder. So he's going to be out of the war for a while. He'll be going back home to Vermont to recuperate for a couple months. And interesting thing happens to him during that time. He ends up engaged to be married, engaged to a young girl named Laura Ainsworth. But it was a secret engagement. So we had another mystery to try to solve. Why a secret engagement? And we think we've got it pretty well figured out, because in with Henry's letters, there was also a small notebook. And in this notebook, Henry had been keeping track of letters he received and letters he sent during the war. Well, up until this time, he had never corresponded with Laura Ainsworth. Now, this is a very small town, and they're the same age. They had to have known each other, but they must not have been very close up until this point. We know that they went on a picnic, that he proposed, but then they swore their friends to secrecy after they told them. So we're thinking that what was going on here is they probably felt that either her parents or his parents would not be happy about this whirlwind romance. He's home on medical leave, and just like that, they're engaged. But they're excited. They want to tell someone, so they tell their friends, but they say, don't tell anyone else for 1 year. And then Henry goes back into the war. Although actually not even into the war at first. Next, he ends up in New York City. Abraham Lincoln is called for a military draft. The draft riots broke out in many cities, especially New York City, where there's going to be hundreds of people killed, thousands of injuries. The entire 6th Corps of the Army will be sent into New York City to maintain order and patrol the streets. So that's where Henry comes back from Vermont and meets up with his regiment there, patrolling the streets. So he's got letters about all the give and take with the local people, about why the Army's there, what they're going to do to maintain order and things while they're positioned there. It's also this time Henry's brother Francis finally enters the service. Now, Francis is the older brother, but he has stayed out of the war into this point. Francis has a lot of problems. He's got physical problems, like stomach disorders, but he also seems to have had kind of emotional or psychological problems. He seems to have suffered from depression, or what they would have called melancholy back in those days. But now he decides he's going to enter. It might be, there was a lot of pressure on young guys. They were expected to do their part and join up. It may also have been, now there's a draft, he might have been thinking it'd be better financially because there were bounties offered by different levels of government if you enlisted. But for whatever reason, he decides now to join up. Francis is also someone who writes very well. He is going to secretly work as a war correspondent for the Vermont Chronicle and Watchman. And when we later found out his pseudonym, we were able to go up to Montpelier, Vermont, where they had 19th century newspapers on microfilm, and get all 12 of the dispatches that Francis sent during the war and include those in with our letters. But anyway, so Francis he's in the Vermont Brigade, different regiment than Henry, but still part of that Vermont Brigade. He will, I said he has a lot of problems. Like, for one thing, he doesn't seem to have much in the way of friends. In one letter, he says he doesn't like going over to his brother's camp because there are so many young guys from Williamstown there in that camp. And there's a lot of people he doesn't want to see. But funny thing about Francis is that this war, which is going to destroy so many young men physically and emotionally, in the case of Francis, he is really going to thrive in this new environment. He's going to become healthier than he's been in a long time. He'll attribute it to the outdoor living, making him healthy. He likes the food. In one letter he writes home to his parents, he says that the camp food agrees with him more than home cooking does, which must have made his mother feel great when she got that letter. Things are going well for him. And in another letter, Henry wrote home. Henry said that they'd been on a long march. He said Francis held up really well. And in another letter, Henry writes home to his parents. He said he was over to Francis's camp to visit them. And he says to his parents, and Francis was happy. And he underlines the word happy. Like, can you believe it? Francis is happy. And he says he has friends. He's doing well. And holds up well in the fight in the Bristow campaign in October, in the Mine Run in November, under our General Meade. Holds up, does well. But things are about to go very poorly for the Vermont soldiers. We have a change in leadership. General Grant, recalled from the West. Grant is going to launch an invasion known as the Overland Campaign. starting with the Battle of the Wilderness, trying to push down towards Richmond. In this Battle of the Wilderness, initial fighting involved mostly the 5th Corps, but then came word the Confederate Corps under A.P. Hill is coming up the Orange Plank Road up towards the Brock Road. Grant realizes if the Confederates take this intersection, that could be the key to the battle. They could divide his forces and defeat him in that way. And so Vermont Brigade is detached from the 6th Corps, sent down to the intersection. Hancock's 2nd Corps is to move forward, together hold that position. Unfortunately, Hancock does not get the message right away. Vermont soldiers arrive first. The Vermont Brigade, about at this point, 2,800 men. They'll be facing this Confederate Corps of about 11,000 coming towards them. And they will refuse to fall back from that position until Hancock does move forward and together hold the position. This monument shows where they made their stand. Out of 2,800 men, 1,234 casualties. Both Henry and Francis are casualties. Francis shot alongside of the neck. It was not life-threatening. Henry shot in the chest. As it turns out, Henry will die 3 days later. Francis by his side, able to write home to his parents about the death of his brother. Francis will then recover in the hospital in Fredericksburg as Grant keeps pushing towards Richmond and Lee keeps moving to block him, fighting several battles. Francis rejoins his unit the day of the Battle of Cold Harbor, which is another terrible defeat for the Union Army. Grant decides to move south of Richmond to try to take Petersburg and block off supply lines. And so Francis will be part of that siege at Petersburg. But then 6th Corps is going to be sent up into the Shenandoah Valley under General Sheridan. And at that point, at Cedar Creek, they will be taken by surprise. Jubal Early's Confederate forces with an early morning surprise attack. Francis will see a friend of his go down. He goes over to try to help him. In the process, he is shot just above the ankle. Francis is then taken to a battlefield hospital site, probably something similar to this one, where it's not the kind of place you want to be in the Civil War. This is an example of a surgeon's kit in the Civil War. A surgeon's kit composed largely of saws and blades, because the great danger is infection. You know, they don't have penicillin or antibiotics or anything, but sometimes if you amputate, then you can stop the infection from spreading through the body. And so Francis is told they don't know what they have to do. They give him chloroform, put him out. He'll wake up in an outside recovery area, probably like this one, to find out that they had amputated the lower portion of his leg. He'll then be taken to a hospital up in Washington, D.C., probably very similar to this one, to recover, and it'll be a very long recovery. They found out there also the amputation had been done so poorly, they had to do a second amputation, much further up his leg. Now, as it turns out, his doctor, who was from Vermont, was keeping his own record book, including a photograph of each patient and the treatment. And we were able to find up at the University of Vermont in special collections the doctor's record book. And it included this photograph of Francis after the second amputation. So Francis said we're going through a very long recovery. He'll eventually decide on getting a prosthetic leg. And we have the actual brochure he ordered from when he chose the company for his prosthetic leg. We also have the doctor's report of just what he needed. And the leg will be received. He will then finally make it home. Also while he was in the hospital, he wrote his final newspaper report. He said in this dispatch, the 19th of October, that's the day of the Battle of Cedar Creek, now of historic note, was an episode in my life ending my career as a soldier and necessitating me to act for the remainder of my days in a sphere entirely different from what I would have chosen. And then tells the story of being shot there at Cedar Creek, of the 2 amputations, his recovery. But the way he concludes, he says, as this is the last of my letters as an Army correspondent, I will say in conclusion that while I regret the casualty which has befallen me, still it's only the fortune of a soldier, and I do not regret that I responded to my country's call. nor feel that I've served to no purpose in a just cause. Though I've never done all I could wish as a soldier, still I've endeavored to do my duty, not shrinking from danger or hardship when called upon, and I am satisfied. If others wish to engage in the same service, I would say to them, the chances are their lot may end up similar to my own, but the cause is worthy of the sacrifice, and I would bid them go forward. So after all he endured, he's saying for the cause they're fighting for, it is all going to be worth it. So he does finally make it home to the family farm. He'll be home for about 6 weeks. At that point, we later found the newspaper article describing what happened next. The newspaper article says, shocking accident. Francis Martin, the son of Chester Martin of Williamstown, known to our readers on the Army as Conscript, that was his pen name for the newspaper, who lost a leg at the Battle of Cedar Creek, was killed Wednesday, October 11th, under the most appalling circumstances. The article goes on to explain that Francis and his father Chester had on their farmland, at one point they had a very large boulder they wanted to get rid of. They had gone out, they dug a hole, they were going to try to pry this boulder into the hole and bury it. But they couldn't budge it. So Chester had gone back to get more helpers. While he's gone, we can only speculate what happened, but our guess is that Francis wanted to show that even on one leg, he could still do the heavy farm labor, had tried to move this boulder. When he didn't return, his mother came looking for him and found him crushed to death beneath the boulder that had fallen back over on top of him. But he had said that regardless of whatever happens to any of them, it's worth it for the cause that they're fighting for. And for those of us who spent many, many years in this, it's been a real worthwhile case for us too, starting those early days, going up to Vermont, doing all the research, getting all the records we could find on births and deaths and weddings and the military records, everything, putting it all together for all the people, eventually putting together a family tree to connect to these soldiers. Way back when my hair was still brown, we were able to do that. And eventually to ultimately to put together the book, Voices from the Attic. And I can remember when we first found these letters, I had mentioned to my younger daughter about finding all these Civil War letters and telling her that maybe someday I may even write a book about it. And she thought about that for a moment and said, well, do you think you could add in some vampires? Because that would make it a much better story. But I don't think we needed the vampires. That ended up being a pretty good story as it was. So that is my story. So thank you all for listening. And I think we have a little time. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to hear them. Yes. Yeah. So how we are related. It took us quite a while to put together this connection. That what we later learned was the father, Chester, had 4 children. 2 of them had died young, and then the 2 boys die in the war, and then just after the war, his wife dies. So at that point, he's approaching 70 years old, alone on this big farm. He ends up getting married to a widow, a woman named Adelia Hill, and Adelia Hill had a daughter named Lucia, married to Benjamin Sibley. Benjamin and Lucia had moved out to Kansas under the Land Grant Act and got settled there. But now Chester and his new wife contact them and say, would you consider coming back to Vermont and working this farm for us, and we'll leave it to you. And so the Sibleys returned, including their children, one of their children being a 4-year-old daughter named Bernice. Bernice will grow up and marry my grandfather. So that was the connection. Now, as it turns out, Bernice died relatively young. Bernice died in the early 40s. And then my grandfather married my grandmother. But we're thinking, what must have happened was, as a 4-year-old coming back to Vermont, she had this new grandfather in Chester. He probably talked about his sons a lot, maybe read some of these letters to her. So for whatever reason, she must have taken the box of letters with her into her marriage to my grandfather. And then after she died, the letters would have still been there with him. After my grandparents died, my father had gone up to Vermont and cleared out their house back in the 1980s. So I'm thinking, when he cleared out their house, he probably found this old box of letters, maybe up in their attic, and brought them back to Pittsburgh and thought to himself, I'm gonna have to look at these someday, and put them up in his attic. And that's where I found them many years later. And I don't think he had any idea what was up there. And that's why he never mentioned to me about them, about these letters. So that is the family connection. It's not a real close connection to the soldiers, but that is the connection that we have. Any other questions?
When did you start to work on the book?
Well, it was back 2005, maybe. I'm just so it was in the early 2000s, and I mean, we say work on the book. I mean, it was many years of working on the letters and research, and then after we did all that and traveling around all that, then we started actually working on the book, which would probably be more like 2012 or 13, something like that. And so I would like do rough drafts of each chapter, and then take them, and Bill and Ed and Carol and Nancy would go through word by word each chapter, and we'd change things all around. And so it was very much of a group effort putting the whole thing together.
So basically, the book then is the story of the letters as kind of you told them now, but in the book is more detailed.
Yeah, it's that plus our own story of finding the letters, what we all did with them. It's both stories together. And maybe just one last thing to close with, because a question a lot of people ask sometimes is, what about the fiance, Laura Ainsworth? We know what happened with her. And ends up being kind of an interesting story that Laura Ainsworth does get married a few years later. She marries a distant cousin named James Edwards Ainsworth. And James Ainsworth was a civil engineer with railroad companies out west. He became very wealthy. In fact, there's a town, Ainsworth, Nebraska, named for him. After he died, they had no children. Laura Ainsworth came back to the little town of Williamstown as this very wealthy widow, and became sort of like a lesser version of Andrew Carnegie, just giving her wealth away. So in Williamstown today, the local library is the Laura Ainsworth Memorial Library. Just outside of town is Ainsworth State Forest on lands that she gave to the state. At nearby Norwich University is Ainsworth Hall, with money she gave for that. And she gave money for schools and fire companies and all kinds of things. And so ended up having a very interesting life herself. So anyway, that is my story. And the book, if any of you are interested in getting in more depth in the book is available on Amazon. It costs $19.95 plus shipping and handling and taxes and all that. But if you act now, as they say on TV, I did bring some books along that I have downstairs that I'm selling for the same $19.95, but I've already paid shipping, handling, and taxes, so that's all covered for you. And so, and just to keep things really simple, for an additional 5 cents to make it even $20, you can even have it signed by the author. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. That's a good segue into inviting you downstairs.